chosen generation, rise up, holy nation. God, we live for you. You have called us out of darkness into light so glorious. God, we live for you. We live for you. God, we live for you. For your name we run. Freedom, you've broken every chain we run. Our God will not be moved. Our God will never be shaken. We run to you, we run. We are chosen. For your name we run. Freedom, you've broken every chain we run. Our God will not be moved. Our God will never be shaken. We run to you, we run. We are chosen generation. Rise up, holy nation. God, we live for you. You have called us out of darkness into light so glorious. God, we live for you. Our God will not be moved. Our God will not be moved.
Our God will never be shaken.
Our God will not be moved.
Our God will never be shaken.
Our God will not be moved. Our God will never be shaken. We run to you, we run. We are chosen generation. Rise up, holy nation. God, we live for you. You have called us out of darkness into light so glorious. God, we live for you. You are everything, more than all we need. God, we live for you. We live for you. I found this world to be not enough for me. God, we live for you. We live for you. We are chosen generation. Rise up, holy nation. God, we live for you. You have called us out of darkness into light so glorious. God, we live for you. Welcome, First Baptist Church of Pearl City. How are we doing today? God is calling you. God is calling you to move. It might be moving around and just speaking the word of gospel to your friends and your neighbors or to your one. But we'd just like to thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you guys are having an awesome day today. Let's just continue worship. Good God Almighty, I hope you find me. Praising your name no matter what comes. Sometimes I call the things so broken down. You stood up, catch me up like you do ever. I get that leisure, I forget that you keep coming around. Yeah, ain't no way you never let me down. Good God Almighty, I hope you'll find me. Praising your name no matter what comes. 'Cause I know where I'd be without your mercy. So I keep praising your name at the top of my lungs. Tell me, is he good?
He's good.
Tell me, is he God?
He's kind.
He is good God Almighty. See, your love goes on forever, that your mercy never stops. So why should I continue to be somebody that you're not? Like the sun in the morning, I know you're gonna be there every day. So what on earth can make me feel great? Good God Almighty, I hope you find me. Praising your name no matter what comes. 'Cause I know where I'd be without your mercy. So I keep praising your name at the top of my lungs. Is he good?
He's good.
Is he God?
He's kind.
He is good God Almighty. Praise him in the morning, praise him in the noontime, praise him when the sun goes down. Love him in the morning, love him in the noontime, love him when the sun goes down. Good God Almighty, I hope you find me. Praising your name no matter what comes. 'Cause I know where I'd be without your mercy. So I keep praising your name at the top of my lungs. Is he good?
He's good.
Is he God?
He's kind.
Is good God Almighty. Jesus in the morning, Jesus in the noontime, Jesus when the sun goes down. Jesus in the morning, Jesus in the noontime, Jesus when the sun goes down. People come together, strangers, neighbors, our blood is one. all you heavens, let the praise go up as the walls come down. All creation, everything with breath, repeat the sound. All his children, clean hands, pure heart, good grace, good God. His name is Jesus. Swing wide, all you heaven, let the praise go up as the walls come down. All creation, everything with breath, repeat the sound. All his children, clean hands, pure heart, good grace, good God. His name is Jesus.
Well, good morning. I'd like to begin our time together this morning by reading a familiar passage. That I believe most of us we've heard or we've seen. In fact, it's serves as the foundation behind our mission state for our church here. And the passage I'm referring to is found in the Gospel of Matthew, the 28th chapter, starting at verse 16. Many of us, we know it as the Great Commission. This commission that Jesus issues in talking to the disciples. And so I want us to kind of take a look at what's going on here, and it'll kind of serve as our starting point. So let me read that for us. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, starting with verse 16, says this: Then the 11 disciples left for Galilee, going to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some of them doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. As we go through these verses here, really as I was reading through, I had to kind of brush off, some of my textbooks from seminary, especially the Greek ones, and I hope to do it some justice. But let me just say that this passage, this great commission that is so commonly used in our churches, it is one of the more, what I would consider commonly mistranslated passages in the Bible. and I don't want to take things out of context this morning, so let me just kind of give a brief breakdown of this passage. This commission here, it starts out, right? We start on verse 16 and 17. And what's Matthew's doing is he kind of, he starts out with the who and the where. And that's fairly straightforward. He does, and so as we kind of move on to the next verse, and we're just going to quickly just kind of skim through this. Again, it's somewhat straightforward, right? Verse 18, and so, but when we move into the 19th verse, it's there that we see at times things being a little bit shifted or taken out of context, and it starts with the word go. And I guess because we assume that because go on most accounts is a verb, right? Going, to go, like it's kind of this action, it's this thing that we do, and I guess because we assume that go is a verb, it ought to be written more as this kind of an imperative command, as kind of this action that's telling us what we need to be doing. Now in most cases that would be pretty accurate. But however here, in the original Greek here, it's not an imperative verb, but rather it's written as a passive participle. And now in this case, with this verb being this passive participle, the subject does not do the action, but rather the action is done to the subject. So in reading this, if we were to read it through the Greek, instead of what we see here, therefore go, right? That's what we've been reading, right? And make disciples of all nations. It would read more like going, therefore make disciples of all nations. And it kind of changes the whole deal here, so the urgency here is not so much on go as it is to make, right? The go part, well, that's already happening. It's kind of assumed here in the passage that this going out, it's ongoing, right? Like going, therefore, right? So it's ongoing. It already started and it's still going. So we're not really worried about the go part because it already started and it's continuing to happen. But then the urgency then is focused on investing, right? It's focused on building, pouring into, making disciples. And let me just say that I'm totally on board with this, but I also understand that if we're going to make disciples, we're going to need Christ followers. Without Christ followers, we don't have disciples of Christ. And so I believe we approach reaching those in need of Christ in the same way, with this same urgency here. And with that said, I want to kind of sort of paint a picture for us this morning, as we move into our teaching points, our applications, and and so here's the deal, most of us who, here who drive, I believe have found ourselves in a similar situation. Here's the deal, okay, so here's, we're driving. Okay, so just kind of picture the scene. You're in the driver's seat. If you don't have a license, picture yourself in the passenger seat. But if you do, you're in the driver's seat, and we find ourselves approaching, an intersection. And most of us who have licenses will be aware that in an intersection you have one of three choices, right? You have a green light, yellow light, red light. That's kind of the only choices we have, unless it's not working, and you just take your chances, right? And so the closer we get to the intersection, we realize that, perhaps the light has changed, right? From green, what was once green is now in transition to yellow. And if you are a rule follower, or you kind of drive like Miss Daisy or whatever, this is an indication, right, to slow down. Yellow light, and you just start slowing down, right? And because red means to stop. Now, there are some of us here where I'm convinced that that's the deal, right? Yellow light, we slow down. But that approach isn't always the norm. In fact, this past week I saw it like it was just terrible, man, because I think at times when we see this yellow light, and if, for some of us, there's if we're past the point of no return, then rather than slow down, we tend to speed up, and I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands and to kind of come to some kind of admission of guilt here, but I'll say that yesterday when I was driving in the morning on Cam Highway, I saw the light, and I was kind of far enough away where I was like, okay, I'm going to slow down. So I'm slowing down, and there was a car about 100 feet behind me that saw the same yellow light that started speeding up, And so as that car went through the intersection, most times when I go through this, I would say at worst the light is orange because it's in transition to red, But this was full on red. The only difference was this guy had a siren on top of his car and my truck just was a regular vehicle, But his siren wasn't on and I guess he was late for something and so he just zoomed through the intersection as it was fully red, right? But I say this because, we sometimes when we get to this point, we convince ourselves that we are at that point and that, that either we've passed the point of slowing down and so now the whole goal is to proceed or to get through the intersection, one, and not get hit, but to get through it and make the intersection before it turns red. Because if it's yellow and we hit it, right, then, we're all good, right? And so there's this sense of urgency that we tend to kind of pick up the pace and then we just kind of just zoom through. And we do so as if our lives depended on it. And in some cases it probably would, right, if other cars were coming. And now sometimes I will say that my decision may be questionable, if I'm driving and my wife is with me, she'll be like, yellow light, and then, she might like, I think that was red, and I'll be like, nah, I think it was orange, I don't know, I mean, and we go through it, but there's this sense of urgency that I feel like, okay, like if either I'm going to slam on my brakes or we're going to keep going. And I realize some of you might be thinking right now, what in the world does, driving techniques have to do with the Great Commission? Well, let me try and bring this back around to connect the dots here. And you see, sometimes when we see a green light, and again, I'm kind of basing this off of my own experiences in driving. When I see a green light, I don't really feel like there's a deep sense of urgency. I feel like it's green, man. So I just kind of keep going at the leisurely pace that perhaps I'm going because I feel because it's green, good night, I have all the time in the world. I don't have to speed up. It's green, and so we just kind of coast on through. Now, most of us, I believe that's kind of the case, But when we see yellow, again, and if we're past that point of no return, we tend to kind of speed up. There's this sense of urgency to get through to the other side. And the reason why I share this is because I believe that when it comes to the sharing of our story of faith, it's quite similar. You see, because I feel like most Christians, and it may seem like I'm pointing the finger, and to a degree I am, but I feel like I'm there in the front of those being pointed at. Because, man, when it comes to the sharing of our faith story, I think we approach it with this green light mentality where, we know that we should do it. We should go, thus the green light. When it's green light, we feel like we know we should go. There's not a sense of urgency because it's green. There's red on the other side, so if I just keep going through, I can just kind of leisurely take my time, kind of go through it. And if I don't, then if it turns yellow or red, well, then you know what, I can put on the brakes. But if we're committed in a yellow light, there is this sense of urgency. And you see, I believe like for the vast majority of the church, we've tended to lose, we've lost that sense of urgency to share our story of faith. We have. And again, some of you may be in the opposite end of the spectrum, but I think a lot of the people I talk to, there's not that yellow light mentality, that urgency that, man, I kind of got to do this. Man, my life or my well-being or the well-being of those that I care deeply about depends on this. So I want us to kind of keep that in the back of our minds, kind of tuck that away as we kind of look at our applications. And again, I'm not encouraging us or saying that it is, it is good to speed through yellow lights, to disregard the traffic light signals, because that wouldn't be good. But my prayer is that we would approach the sharing of our faith story with the same type of urgency as one has when they accelerate through a yellow light. And I'm convinced that if we did, that sign back there would be totally lit up. So that's kind of the deal where we're kind of heading there. And so after painting this picture for us on the canvas of our sermon this morning, I'd like for us to spend a few moments taking a look at a few practices that, if taken to heart and approached with the same sense of urgency that's birthed out of a yellow light, I believe it'll definitely make an impact, on how we share God's love with those around us. And so, let's just kind of just dive right on in. And so here we go. The first thing is this. Yellow light evangelism, which I just kind of, I don't even know if that's a thing, but it is in my brain, But this yellow light evangelism, it prompts us to proceed with urgency to build bridges. Okay? Now, if we're going to effectively share God's love with those around us, if we're going to engage in these spiritual or gospel conversations, or attempt to make disciples, it begins with the development of relationships, spending time, loving, and investing in others. Those that I trust most in life are individuals who've invested in my life, who've poured into my life, who've taken the time to spend quality time with me, share a meal, speak truth into my life. Taking time to sit down and pray with me. And it's through those times that solid bridges were built. And let me just say this, that it's hard to build bridges, when we don't know what's on the other side, or rather, when we don't know who's on the other side. It's different. Like if you don't know somebody and they just come up to you and they start saying a whole lot of stuff, this is what I think you should do. Most of us, we would be like, man, who are you? Who are you to tell me what I should do? Right? But it's through times when bridges are built. I'll say this. You know, one of the most amazing things that I've ever encountered was, you know, we were living up in Palisades, and man, people would always come, and they would come Saturday mornings. Our girls were young, and they would want to come and share their faith with, I mean, I guess I look like I need help. And so there were, you know, the Mormons would come, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they would always come when you know, my wife wasn't home or just be me. And so, you know, I'm game. I like talking to different people. But I could tell you that one of the things that left this amazing, this indelible mark was when this same group of people from the Kingdom Hall, you know, that was kind of, I don't know where it was, but they were from these Jehovah's Witnesses, and they would come and they would sit and they would stand, or, you know, and they would come oftentimes when I would be doing laundry, right? You know, and so they would say, you know, so they'd be talking to me, and then they would be like, you know, can we help you? And I was like, for certain, man. You know, why don't you hang up all those laundry, you know? And so I'm throwing laundry into stuff, and they're hanging up, and I think my wife came home one time wondering who's hanging our clothes, you know? But you know, and they did it with joy, and you know, like, so they would come frequently, and we would talk, and we'd have these amazing conversations where, you know, they would share what they believe, and I get to share what I believe, you know. But I can tell you that, man, they kind of had it right, where they understood what it meant to build bridges. Now, you know, what we believe, we're totally in different camps, but they totally understood what it meant to build bridges. You know, and the following week, I was way more open to discussing things further with them. You know, and I believe that's how they went around the neighborhood, and they had a chance to talk with all different types of people, because they understood the practice of building bridges. And you see, when bridges are built, trust is developed. Investments are made, and quite often that happens over time. It doesn't happen overnight. And here's the deal, you know, most believers, I'm convinced, are, you know, I mean, most most believers, they are reluctant to share their faith. Most people that I talk to. And the reason being is because there's this fear of rejection. This fear that, you know, like, well, what if I say this and they reject me? What if I share this and they no longer want to consider me a friend? What if I talk with a family member and it causes this tension in our relationship? And really, this is something on all accounts that it shouldn't surprise us at all. Because for decades, for centuries, I believe the church in general has condemned sin, and in connection to that, the church has condemned the sinner. There's this perspective of the church being extremely judgmental. And it creates this gap between those in the church and those outside. And I say this because when I talk to people in the church and I talk to those outside of the church, two different perspectives. Those in the church, man, they will tell me why, and it's all because of God's love. That's why they're there. I mean, they're in the church. They've experienced it. They are grateful for God's love. But those outside of the church have this defense mechanism of this walls are up because they haven't yet experienced that. But what they have experienced is God's judgment. And share that because if we're going to reach the community around us, we need to start bridging that gap. We need to begin to develop relationships, invest in friendships, building bridges. You see, these are the things that I believe help us to do that. There's another thing I want us to look at this morning in regards to this yellow light evangelism, because it also prompts us to proceed with urgency to share our story. We've built bridges. We kind of have that connection. They're open. People are open to hearing because they trust us. We're not going to kind of lead them astray. We're not going to just cast judgment on top people. And so when you get to that point, this yellow light evangelism mentality, it prompts us to proceed with a deep sense of urgency to share our story. And so let me start with this. Every follower of Jesus has a story of faith. But if we want to share that story with others, we need to understand what it means to communicate it clearly and effectively. See, basically, when you share your story of faith, it needs to be not the exhaustive version, but more the cliff notes, the simplified version. And I'm saying that to share our story is to express with others, how we came to faith. How we came to know God personally and how that experience changed our lives. And to do that, we need to remember that it's not solely about us. We're not the stars of that story, yeah? Because it's really a story about God and how He changed us. Not how, with God's assistance, I paved the way, right? It's a story about God. And so as we communicate our story, let me just throw out a few helpful things to consider in the sharing of our story of faith. And the first is, I think we need to be authentic. We need to tell our story the way it happened, There's no need to embellish it. There's, or to compare ourselves to others or to dwell in the past. Because really, it's our story. It's your story. It's my story. And it's unique to who we are, to our lives. So share it in the way that God intended you to share it. But it's also important to be intentional. We may not always have all the time in the world, so be intentional. Oftentimes, if people, ask me a question, and the weird thing is, and I don't know if this is a good or a bad thing, I often have opportunities to share my story of faith, and it's not because I kind of am really gifted and set it up, and I'm this amazing evangelist kind of person, and really it's not, because people will, I haven't seen in a long time, will say, hey, what are you doing now? And I'd be like, wow, yeah, I'm serving at the church, like, what? The church? What are you talking about? I said, the one right across the intermediate school where went to intermediate? Yeah, I know that place. And they would be like, okay, yeah, like, what do you do there? And so sometimes I'll ask, and I shouldn't, but I do. Well, what do you think I do there? And there are many variations of responses, of which pastor has not even entered the atmosphere of that, right? Oh, well, you do maintenance over there? Like what? I don't even do maintenance at my house. It's kind of like, but, so I say, when I say, I serve as the pastor. And they're like, well, how did that happen? But at that point, I have an opportunity to share my story of faith. And when they're not asking like, hey, by the way, I have about 45 minutes. Tell me your story. No, man, we're looking at maybe about, 2 to 3 minutes. That's about it. And so I have to be intentional about sharing this story that God has written for me. I heard it put this way: our story of faith really only has 3 chapters. There's chapter 1, which should provide a glimpse of our life before we met Jesus. Right? And so when I'm sharing this, man, I don't really have to focus on this because those guys were in the first chapter. They know what was going on in the first chapter. We don't have to relive the first chapter, but at least they know and they get a glimpse of it. And then there's chapter 2, which highlights how we met Jesus. That's important. And finally, chapter 3, which tells the story of how our relationship with Jesus has changed our lives. Oftentimes, in sharing our story of faith, people may have had an idea of what went on in chapter 1, but chapter 3 should make all the difference in the world. Again, we may not always have all the time in the world, so be intentional about the things that we choose to share. And also, it's important to keep it simple. And I would suggest that we avoid, these overly religious words. I think in the church sometimes we tend to use these words, and and I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing, but I think those outside of the church, man, it doesn't help at all. I could tell you a good example would be like when I was on the trip, we went up, we took our kids to school. Then Jan and Rin, they stayed up in Washington, and Reese and I, went down, helped her get settled in at CBU. One of the nights, we had a free night. We decided to go and take in the Angels games, I love watching baseball live, right, And so I'm trying to explain it to my daughter. And again, it's kind of like if you grew up playing baseball, you use all this baseball terminology, and she's looking at me like, okay, this, and I'm explaining, and she's looking, not getting it. I don't understand. And I'm trying to explain it. The more I try to explain it, the more of the game I'm missing, and I'm just like, man, this is terrible. It dawns on me that, man, I'm trying to kind of give her the very exhaustive version of what she should understand. Using, terminology as, RBI or all these things. Like, I don't know, what is that? Like, she didn't even know how much strikes every batter gets. She's not a fan, so, which was sad for me, but that's all right. That's another story. But see, in the same way with the church, when we go out and we share our story and we start using terminology, things that just that don't resonate with them at all, that short window, that short span that we have to share that story, man, it's lost. Craig Lascalzo, who's been here a couple times during our winter Bible study, was my professor of homiletics, of preaching, right? So homiletics is one of those words like you don't even need to use it because actually it's just preaching, right? So but he would say this. It doesn't do anyone any good if you're up there in the front of the church and you start spouting off things that no one knows. Like you can start using all the Greek words or the Hebrew words, or, start saying different things, or the study, like eschatology or ecclesiology. You can start going all of that. But if no one knows a single thing that you're saying, it doesn't do anyone any good. And so he said in matters of preaching the Word of God, he would say, keep it simple. And I think that holds true in matters of sharing our story of faith. Man, if we want those to whom we're sharing it with to understand, to hear us, then we need to keep it simple. And lastly, yellow light evangelism, I believe it prompts us to proceed with urgency to live our story. And I feel like this is somewhat self-explanatory, but if it were that simple, everyone could or would be doing it. Now, I'm not saying that people aren't living their story. I am saying, though, that living our story doesn't only happen on Sunday mornings. It doesn't only happen when we attend a Bible study, whether it be online or in person. It doesn't only happen when things are going well. But living our story means that it ought to, what does it look like all day, every day? The crazy thing is that everyone can live their story. In fact, everyone is, but the question is, what story are we living? Living our story of faith is based on the one to whom we're living for. Which ought to be Jesus Christ. You see, because if we're living for ourselves, there's a story there. But it's one that's more of us than of faith. You see, when we live out our story of faith, what we're saying is we're choosing to live a life in obedience to the Lord. I like what Pope Paul VI, I was reading this article about evangelism, and it said in this article, it said in 1975 he wrote this apostolic exhortation, entitled Evangeliae non Deandi, and this was this work that it was kind of referred to as the foundation for modern evangelism in the Catholic Church. And basically Pope Paul, Paul VI, what he did was he called for each person, in the church, not only to deepen their belief, right? Their belief and faith in God and the gospel message, which I think that's an admirable thing, is super important, right? But not only to deepen their faith, right? And their belief in God and the gospel message, but to live it. Right? And so here's what he writes. He shares this thought. He says, modern man listens more willingly to witnesses than to teachers. And if he does listen to teachers, it is because they are witnesses. Okay? Let me read it again. Modern man listens more willingly to witnesses than to teachers. And if he does listen to teachers, it is because they are witnesses. And I believe, he shares this because, if we're going to share our story of faith with others, it only happens, when we start getting intentional about living it. You know? It can't happen. You know, it would just be words. So live your story of faith. You know, I'd like to just wrap things up this morning by sharing an experience I had. It was one of the worst experiences or feelings that I ever felt. You know, a little over a decade ago, I got a call, and you know, and I get calls all the time about the you know, asking if I'll do a funeral, or, you know, I'll come and meet with a family because a family member is sick, or they, you know, just passed away. And, you know, and I'll say that, yeah, you know, it's, you know, it does affect me in a way that, you know, like, you know, I got to do things afterwards just to kind of release and stuff like that. But in this one particular situation, I got this call, and, you know, the call was from a family member, and they asked if I would do this funeral of, and this guy was a friend of mine. He was a few years younger, you know, and it was because, you know, he was involved in this kind of this freak accident, you know, and basically he was operating this big backhoe, and as he was digging this thing, the backhoe tipped over, and he actually ended up under it, and I don't know if there was other people there, but when they finally found him, you know, it was he wasn't alive anymore, and so, you know, the whole situation, you know, and so I get this call, you know, and I'm, you know, I'm just kind of devastated, you know, and again, I feel that way about, you know, all the calls I get, but this one in particular, and this is why, you know, a few weeks earlier, you know, I was spending time in, you know, just kind of reading and praying, and oftentimes, you know, I'll be intentional about things, but sometimes I'll just be like, Lord, just, you know, if there are things that you want, you know, just, you know, kind of just, you know, you got to reveal those things to me, and it was during that time where, man, his name just kept coming up. You know, it was this nudging of the Spirit where, you know, it was like, man, I think you need to share your story of faith with him. Now, keep in mind, this guy is probably one of the most amazing, nicest guys you would ever meet, you know. He would go around, like, you know, buying bentos for the elderly parents in the neighborhood. He would do all of these things, you know, and you know, he just was this super nice guy. I remember speaking at his funeral saying that, you know, one of the things that, you know, that for me was, you know, when I would say, hey, you know, we're doing this, and he would say, okay, you know what, I'll come over, I'm going to help you do them. And it wasn't like, some people will say it just because that's the nice thing to say. You know, he was like, okay, I'm going to drop everything. You need me to take some days off at work, and he would actually do it. You know, and his name just kept coming up, and how I responded was just anything but how I should have, because I was like, well, you know, he knows me. He knows my story of faith. You know, I did their premarital counseling, so he knows that I'm a pastor, so he should know that where I'm at, right? You know, that he's this good guy, you know, but yet, then I also thought, like, but he's young. You know, and so, man, I there's always, you know, tomorrow, next month, next year, you know, like, man, maybe, Lord, it just needs to be the right timing where this, you know, there's like this divine appointment, not this forced thing. And so, you know, I never called him. And there were a few times where maybe I should call him today, and I didn't. You know, and the reason why I share this is because oftentimes that's how we feel when it comes to the sharing of our faith story. It is. You know, we think that, you know, man, you know, maybe it's not right now. The conditions aren't the way I want it to be. or we think like, there's always tomorrow. They're healthy, they're young, maybe when they're a little bit more open, because I don't want to upset or offset anything going on here. And the list can go on and on and on. And really, there is always tomorrow. There is. And if we were to kind of just, there is always more time. There really is, until there isn't. You see, when it comes to sharing the love of God with those around us, my prayer for us, individually as well as a church, is that we approach it with an urgency, as if there's no tomorrow. Because really, sometimes there isn't. Let's pray. Our Father, Lord, we come this morning and we've talked about your faith story, our faith story that you've orchestrated in our lives. And God, our prayer is simple. That you, Lord, would give us the courage, that you would give us the strength to be able to do this, the wisdom, the words to say. And Father, I believe that you've placed people on our hearts, God, that perhaps we need to kind of be intentional about going out and sharing that story with. And so, Father, my prayer is that you would nudge our spirit, and that you would allow us to develop this sense of urgency, God, to go out and to share it, no matter what the outcome. That we wouldn't develop the mindset of a green light, that there's always more time, but that this deep urgency associated with a yellow light, Lord. So we ask, God, for the filling of your Spirit to be able to do that. That's our prayer, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
Song of peace.
that starts the urgency, church. The time is now. Let's rise. Let's rise to the occasion. Let's speak to our one. And let's share the love of Jesus with everyone. And as Pastor just illustrated today, maybe it's just a sense of God showing us what we need to do. So during your prayer time this week, just allow God to talk to you and encourage you and nudge you to that one person. We thank you for worshiping with us today. And no matter what you're going through during the week, remember to turn your eyes to Jesus. He knows best, and He knows what's best for you. If you are here in person, you are dismissed. As you exit, please be mindful of social distancing. Thank you again.